Good morning. Let's begin. Morning. So, in our studies this quarter about worship, we looked at some of the big picture of worship, and then we looked at for several weeks at the communion, which was the distinctively Christian element of worship that the Jews, for example, and others did not have. And we looked at a little bit of evolution of communion from being in the middle of the fellowship meal to being moved separately from it in order to avoid certain problems that arose, like we read about in 1 Corinthians. And we began talking about singing, and we saw that the New Testament doesn't have a whole lot of passages about the music of Christian worship, but the passages it does have talk about singing, and we looked at the phrase psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. We looked at the diversity of worship music that implies. And today I want to look at what are the principles of biblical interpretation that come about when we examine the passages about music. Now, in the Protestant Reformation, which started in the 1500s, the 16th century, there was a desire to get away from what were seen as traditions of men that were developed outside of the Bible. The Swiss Reformation, which is the ancestor of a lot of denominations that we see in America, Presbyterian, Reformed, Baptist, and so on, had a particular emphasis on this, that we should rely solely upon the Bible. The Latin phrase was sola scriptura, that we don't look to church authorities outside of the Bible to determine our practices and our beliefs, and we don't look to propagate human traditions. Of course, people are imperfect, and we unwittingly sometimes will propagate our own traditions. But their goal was to discard anything that was just a tradition. And they developed an idea with John Calvin and others that came to be called later the regulative principle of worship. Regulative means our worship is regulated by Scripture, it's restricted by Scripture. We should only have elements in our worship that come from the Scriptures, not just from our traditions. Now, in the 19th century, there was a lot of development along the lines of adding instruments to worship, particularly in America, but also in Europe. And it was a gradual thing. And the leaders, especially of these Presbyterian, Reformed, and Baptist churches, at first were greatly resistant to this development. We can read a lot of their writings, and also in the 19th century, there was a movement in Great Britain and the U.S. called the Restoration Movement, which led to Churches of Christ, among others. The Restoration Movement sought to restore first century Christianity free of any traditions that had arisen in the meantime that would serve to divide us. So it was restoration and it was unity. And the pioneers of that restoration movement came primarily from Presbyterian churches and also Baptist churches. And so they were very familiar, and if you study a lot of issues from the 19th century, there's actually a lot of Presbyterian language, the more conservative Presbyterian language, like the regulative principle of worship and so on, you will find in the American Restoration movement. So the leaders of these various strains of Christianity fought against adding instruments, but they were fighting a gradually losing battle. And if you read the documents of the time, and I mentioned this last time, the feeling was, well, people like them, they're not explicitly forbidden, and maybe they'll go to that church down the street that has music they like more or something if we don't do it. This was one of the issues that eventually divided the Restoration movement. Our movement was intended to be a unity movement, and unfortunately, we ended up with multiple churches. The Christian churches, the Churches of Christ, the Disciples of Christ, all came out of the Restoration movement. And there were 2 or 3 significant issues that led to this splintering. But the issue of music and worship was one of the prominent ones. Now, what was the common approach to arguing this issue in the Churches of Christ? And is it the best approach? The basic approach was a sola scriptura approach, that we can only worship as we're commanded or directly implied to in the New Testament. And so if an element of worship is not found in the New Testament as a command or as an implication that you should be doing this, then doing it means you're following human will, not God's will. You're adding what humans desire, not what God has expressed his desire for in Scripture. Therefore, it's not an act of faith, it's more an act of your own will. An act of faith trusts God to express his will. And in particular, it was said that anything upon which Scripture is silent is forbidden. Now, Ephesians 5 and Colossians 3, we read, sing to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. That it talks about singing. It doesn't talk about instruments. And so the argument was, therefore, instruments are forbidden. Now, examples were taken from various places in Scripture to support this principle that silence means prohibition. For example, Noah was told to build an ark out of gopher wood in Genesis 6:14. Therefore, building it out of oak or pine wood is forbidden. Now, that was intended to reinforce the idea that silence means forbidden, prohibition. It was always kind of an awkward example because we don't even know what gopher wood means. It's a funny Hebrew word that doesn't seem to have any other words with the same root. And so the King James Version translators chose the word gopher because they thought it was somewhat similar to the word for the animal, but most of your translations will say cypress wood because that's our best guess of what the word actually means. So it was always a little bit of an awkward argument to talk about how these specific words are forbidding things that aren't mentioned when we don't know what all those words mean. But there were 19th century and to the present disputes, however, over how to interpret the silence of Scripture on certain matters. Those who favored instrumental accompaniment to singing came up with various critiques about the silence of Scripture. For example, the New Testament, when it doesn't say that we should sing with hymnals or that we should have pews to sit in or whatever, so does that mean, since the Scriptures are silent about these things, does that mean they're forbidden? And the answer from the a cappella group was, well, those things aren't separate acts of worship. A pew is not an element of worship. A hymnal is not an element of worship. They are merely aids to an element of worship. They were called expedients, something that was helpful to some other thing. Then the other side replied, well, we say instruments are just an aid to singing. That puts them in the same category as a hymnal. They're not a separate worship act. Let me look at what I think are a couple of problems with the traditional Church of Christ argument, what I think is a simpler, better approach to interpretation of language. First of all, the language used is churchy language that you don't hear elsewhere. This type of reasoning and use of words like expedient and so on, regulative principle, this is not how we talk about language typically outside of church. So it's not going to be too familiar to newcomers, and the argument can end up kind of floundering in an area of subjectivity. What's an element of worship and what is merely an expedient helping another element of worship? Can you prove it? Can you determine what is? I think language, whether we're talking about biblical language or any other language, is better interpreted according to certain common sense principles that people who study linguistics, study communication, have identified, and which are not some technical church language. Namely, the alternative is to look at the specificity or generality of language. In everyday life, if you get a command, if you get an instruction from a boss at work, you pay close attention to how specific the instructions were. For example, what's the difference between your boss at work saying, get this done by Friday, here, this is your task, or saying, consult with the marketing department, make sure it fits in with their plans, consult with the customer service department, and get this done by Friday? What's the difference? Well, he told you, I'd say he told you to do one thing, but he told you how to do it. The first example, he didn't tell you how to do it, did he? Get it done by Friday. Okay, how? What are the steps? Didn't say, did he? So that kind of implies a certain judgment on your part. What steps are involved? Is one of those steps, consulting some other department? Well, the second example, he got very specific. Right? When someone provides specifics to you, you intuitively think there must be a reason that specifics were given. He wouldn't have bothered to mention them otherwise. But when specifics are not given, when language is very general, the implication is you have some freedom on the details. Details weren't given, you have some freedom on the details. So that brings up the question, well, how specific is New Testament language when it comes to worship, for example? What if those passages in Ephesians and Colossians, instead of saying sing, what if they said, when you come together in your worship, worship me with music? What might that include? It could include playing an instrument while singing, could be a cappella singing, could be playing an instrumental solo, couldn't it? I mean, that's all music, isn't it? If the language were that general, then a lot of things are included, aren't they? But the language wasn't that general. The language didn't just say include music in your worship. The language said sing to one another. So instead of, there must be a reason for specific language. And so instead of talking about what's prohibited and what's silent, talk about What's specific? Instead of saying Noah was forbidden to build an ark out of oak instead of cypress, the more natural approach is to say he was specifically told to build it out of cypress wood. In everyday language, if somebody says, I want you to build an oak table for me for my house, you don't stand around saying, okay, that means I'm forbidden to build it out of pine. I'm forbidden to build it out of maple. That's not a very natural way of thinking. You were specifically told to build it out of oak, so only building it out of oak is going to satisfy the request, right? I mean, you were given something specific. And that's how we interpret language in everyday life. It doesn't require some special church terminology, That's just how we respond to language. However, in addition to looking at how specific or how general language is, there are general principles that govern situations. So my wife calls and says, guests are arriving unexpectedly. Stop by the store and bring enough food to cook for 8 people. Okay, how specific is that? The only thing specific seems to be the quantity. There's 8 people involved total. Right? But there's no specificity, really. Yeah. This is a hypothetical wife who has never existed.
She would not be happy with what
And this is a wife who never has existed, unless we're playing the game of, you should have known what I was thinking, which is different, but that's another subject. The fact that it's not very specific, does that mean you have unlimited freedom of judgment as to what to bring? How about you bring home 8 bags of candy for the 8 people? Would that be okay? You say it wasn't forbidden explicitly, therefore I'm allowed to do it? That's not really a very common sense approach, is it? Why not? Well, first of all, in your family, you probably have a general principle which you have especially communicated to your children, that candy is not a substitute for a meal. And you don't have to repeat that. Well, with some kids you do. But you don't have to repeat that every time you give instructions, right? Your wife didn't have to say to you, and don't bring 8 bags of candy. There's a general principle that's understood. And this is how language works, common sense, everyday language. The general principles don't have to be repeated every time. Because people share, going back to the work example, get this task done by Friday and don't break any laws. Well, that would be kind of a strange instruction from your boss, because at your place of employment, you probably had an orientation session at the beginning where they expressed certain general principles like we're not going to break laws and no one's going to ask you to break laws on the job here. And no employee is going to make this an abusive environment for other employees and so on. And once all these general principles have been established, they don't have to be repeated every day or every time you're given an assignment, right? Your boss doesn't have to say, and don't break any laws, and don't abuse any of the other employees. That doesn't have to be said constantly. That's not the way human communication works, right? There's common background information that people share, and our communication depends on it. And we get into trouble, by the way, when one person has some background info and another person doesn't, and they assume the other person does, but they don't, and they try to communicate. So there's got to be some common background information that the speaker and the listener both possess. And that includes the general principles. And they don't have to be repeated. They're made clear And as long as both parties are clear on the general principles, you don't have to keep repeating them. Are there general principles for worship in the New Testament? Well, there are multiple examples where general principles are established in the New Testament respecting worship. In 1 Corinthians 14, we have a whole chapter about order in worship. There were people who were showing up in the Corinthian church and speaking in tongues, and nobody else could understand, nobody could interpret the tongues. It was of no use to anybody. Paul said, if a visitor, and that's probably a hypothetical visitor, so I don't know how many visitors they really had in worship back then, but especially when they were forced to worship before dawn, as we saw. But he uses the rhetorical device of, kind of like when you say to a kid, what if your parents were here watching you right now? It's a great device for making someone stop and think from a different perspective. Paul says, if a visitor were to come in and witness this, what would they think? They'd think that this is just chaos. This is just, you're crazy. You're not edifying each other, building each other up. There's no benefit to the other people for you doing this. So here we're getting some general principles from 1 Corinthians 14. Worship should be orderly, not chaotic, and it should be for everyone's benefit. It should be understandable to everyone. So those are general principles. And every time the subject of worship comes up elsewhere in Paul's letters, he doesn't have to repeat that. When we studied communion, we looked at 1 Corinthians 11, where we saw the big problem that they had of treating the communion like they were just chowing down on some food. They also had a problem of factionalism. This is food for my family. You can't, have any, and so on. So some general principles are established in that passage that we've read the complete passage. Unity in worship is one of the general principles, as opposed to factionalism. There was also a specific teaching. Don't treat the communion like food. In James, he talks about, what if a rich person comes into your assembly? Are you going to give him the seat of honor and, treat him differently from everybody else? Well, that kind of comes also back to the factionalism idea, but it's not quite factionalism, it's partiality. Are you going to have partiality within the body? If so, is it truly a worship that's unified? So these are all general principles that apply. So when we're looking at how to sing, for example, we have to follow the general principles. Can the singing be everybody just starts singing their own song, different songs at the same time? And, well, Paul doesn't say anything about that in Ephesians 5 or Colossians 3. But is there a general principle that would tell you you shouldn't do that? It's the principle of orderly worship, right? That doesn't have to be repeated in every passage about singing. So what we're going to see is that if we apply the common sense principles, where you pay attention to how specific the language is, that you don't need some unique church terminology to tell you what to do. And in fact, Christians for many, many, many centuries understood that what was asked of them was singing, because that's all it said in the New Testament. And they didn't necessarily look at it in terms of the Bible is silent about this, therefore it's forbidden. The real principle is the Bible is specific about singing and even tells us that the kinds of songs are determined, as we saw last week, by the words. What makes a song of thanksgiving? or praise or encouragement to someone else. It's the words. So I remember an example of, there was an article written by a member of the Christian churches, and one of the few differences between the Christian churches and the churches of Christ is instruments in worship. And this man, though, even though he was in the Christian church, was writing a very honest reflection in the Christian Standard, which is a Christian church magazine. And he talked about how, in the Christian church, we don't say that because the Bible is silent about instruments in Christian worship, that therefore you can't have them. But he said, you know what? I was having a discussion the other day with a Lutheran, and he brought up baptism. And I said, in the Christian church, we baptize believers who are old enough to believe by immersion. And the Lutheran said, we baptize infants by sprinkling. And the man from the Christian church found himself saying, well, there's nothing in the scriptures about that. The scriptures are silent about, baptizing infants and about using sprinkling instead. And then he said, I caught myself. And I said, well, wait a minute. When I'm talking with the Church of Christ people, I tell them that silence doesn't work that way, that it's okay to do something that's not prohibited. If the scriptures are silent, that's okay as long as they're not prohibiting something. But now here I am making an argument from silence to the Lutheran. But my point would be that I don't think that the argument from silence is necessarily the best approach even for him. I was gratified when I read it, but I would say that the argument is the Bible is specific about the subject of baptism. In Romans 6, we find that in baptism we reenact the burial and resurrection of Christ, and that in so doing we appeal to God, bury the old man, raise up a new man. That's very specific language. It doesn't apply to sprinkling. And it doesn't apply to anyone who doesn't have the knowledge to appeal to God, raise me up a new person. So it's not the silence of Scripture about sprinkling infants that matters. What matters is how specific the language is. The language specifically talks about immersing someone in water and them being old enough, by implication, to understand what they're asking for from God. They're asking for a resurrection to a new life. It's the specificity of the language. If it were some general thing about being baptized and using water and not talking about anything else, then I suppose all kinds of baptisms would be fine. Just like if the Bible said, worship me with music, that's so general that all kinds of things would be fine. It's about the specificity. The specific language is people who understand are baptized in a certain way, and it has a certain symbolism and a certain appeal to God, to be raised up to a new life. Just like Noah doesn't have to sit around thinking, okay, I'm forbidden to use oak wood, I'm forbidden to use. That's not the way we normally think. If someone tells you specifically how to be baptized, then the only way to follow the command is to do it that specific way. It's specificity that matters. And we'll look at how this principle applies to some other things next week. Thank you.